Hi everyone, and welcome to Building Your Dream Board. Time is 2 o'clock, so we'll just wait a couple of seconds for everyone to join and then we'll get going. Okay, so we can see those numbers shooting up, so that's great, so we will get going. Hi, so welcome to Building Your Dream Board hosted by Shaparency with our guest speaker, Mark A. Pfister. So it's actually good morning, good afternoon, and good day to everyone, wherever you're watching. And welcome to this first truly international Shaparency webinar. So the series is being created to clarify and demystify the goings-on at boardroom level. My name is Lucy, and I'm the events manager at Shaparency, and I'll be hosting today's session. So before we meet our speaker and the reason we're all here, I'm just going to do a very quick introduction to Shaparency and what we're all about. So our aim is to shake up the board management and board performance sector. The boardroom is the last frontier of digitalization, with less than 15% of boards using a specific tool. So we intend to change that. Shaparency manages every aspect of your board meeting in our secure cloud platform. We store all your documents, prepare and share your agendas, compile board packs, digitalize your minutes, your votes, sign your documents, and soon you'll even be able to measure your board's performance. So exciting. As I mentioned earlier, our free online event series is aimed at demystifying and clarifying everything that happens within an organization at board level. Our hope is that through our event series, we can educate people on board processes, and that will lead to more diverse, more efficient, and more inclusive boards. Okay, so I will very quickly take you through some of the techie stuff for today. By this point, I'm sure you're all quite aware of the format, but just for this webinar. So the purpose of the webinar is to share knowledge and trends on elements of effective board structures. So with most webinars, if you could put your questions into the Q&A section. Mark is here to answer as many questions as possible, but if we get a lot and we don't get through them all, he will follow up via email. So once again, not in the chat function, pop them in the Q&A section and we'll get through as many as possible. We will be sending out all the PDF of the slides from today's session. So if you miss anything, it will all be there. In that email as well, there'll also be information about Shaparency and Mark as well. And also a short survey. And in that survey, we'd love to hear about what you'd like to see in upcoming events. So what would be helpful to you and your organization to have an event on? So it'd be great if you could take 2 minutes just to fill that survey in. You'll also see throughout the presentation that there are additional topic references. So you won't be able to link to them in this presentation, but the PDF that we send out with the follow-up email, you'll be able to link through and delve deeper into all the other references. Okay, so now the reason that we're all here, our speaker for today. So please welcome Mark A. Pfister. He's a CEO and Chief Board Consultant of MA Pfister Strategy Group. So he's a governance and strategy expert, a board director and board consultant, having worked with hundreds of public, private and non-profit boards with focus in strategy, governance, technology and cybersecurity. He's known to us as the board architect for his work in defining the structural components of effective boards. And this is why we're all here today, to just get more effective boards. So I'm sure we'll learn everything in this session. His book, Across the Board, The Modern Architecture Behind an Effective Board of Directors, is a bestseller with circulation in over 70 countries. And as I mentioned before, the attendance for this session, we've got people from those 70 countries. It's a truly international session. So without further ado, it's a big welcome to Mark, and I'll hand over for our session. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Lucy. Such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks to Ben and the entire Shaparency team. You guys have been great, and thank you so much. I appreciate the being with everybody today. So welcome to everybody on today's webinar. It's my pleasure to be here. If we jump right into this, let's just go through some of the goal setting for today, and then we'll get to some of the meat of our talk today. And I think you'll find this helpful, whether you're an aspiring director, whether you're an experienced director, really any board now that you're going to serve on, that you currently serve on. It gives you a way of understanding if that board is successful currently and if it's going to be successful in the future based on its structure, or what I like to call its architecture, which is more the proactive view of a board of directors. So know that whether you're building a new board or you're rebuilding an existing board, this will be valuable to you. And of course, if you're evaluating a board or considering joining a board, for those that I work with in the education and coaching area, I make sure they're asking questions about how a board is built. And you'll see as we go through this, how improperly structured boards add risk to the organization and to you personally as a board director. All right, so the path we'll follow today, quick intro on the importance of proper board architecture, and then the three main areas of what we define as a properly structured board. We'll talk about your board's sphere of influence, your board's planes of congruence, which are horizontal considerations, and the board's coverage and balance, which you'll see that adds the depth to your board. All right, so we'll start out the importance of proper board architecture. So understand, just as the starting point for us today, that properly architected boards ensure adherence to their existence simply based on their structure. So with the hundreds of boards I've worked with, I can tell you the ones that are not built properly have governance issues, and they also have strategic input issues. And the boards that are structured correctly, that structure or the architecture for them inherently helps them in the process and the success of the governance of the organization. There's a direct linkage to this, which is why many years ago I started to delve into this and do the research and come up with many of the concepts that are focused on the architecture of the board, which elevates its effectiveness and its efficiencies. So first off, as a board member, whether you're evaluating whether to join a board or you're on a board, you have to ask yourself these questions. Is this board truly successful? Is this board making an impact, a positive impact? And is this board respected? I can tell you that many boards that I work with, they start out with their relationships with the CEO, and they're viewed by the organization as not really having the level of respect that that board particularly needs. In many cases, this comes back to their efficiency, their effectiveness, and I will tell you, as you'll see today, it comes back to how they're structured and how that has a correlation to their governance. So we first ask ourselves these questions, and then we say to ourselves also, if we leverage the following 5 reasons for a board's existence, these are great questions to ask both yourself if you're a board candidate or if you're currently sitting on a board. So does the board promote meaningful action? Is it driving strategic focus? Is it guiding prioritization within the organization? Is it preventing goal diversions, right? Very simple questions to ask. And for some of you on today's webinar, you probably recognize these as an immediate yes or no answer if those are being met. Does your board foster accountability? Does it promote discipline, act as a critical sounding board? Does it emphasize urgency in the organization through the CEO, or in the nonprofit scenario through the executive director? Does the board itself as an entity convey trustworthiness? Does it help to build the brand's comfort, right? Does it build credibility? Does it show the company attracts professionals, right? These are all areas that add to the board's perception, both internal to the organization and externally to that level of trustworthiness. Does the board grow the networks of the organization? So does it allow for expanded connections to people? Does it allow for expanded access to resources and to data, right? Some of the best board members I know, they are actually the catalyst to bringing new data, new concepts, and even guest speakers into the boardroom that educate on areas that the board is not aware of. Great example of how boards can grow networks. And does the board provide mediation? This is quite an interesting one to think about. So is it providing mediation or in some cases working with shareholders and stakeholders? Is it available during tough decisions for the organization? And if we view this as working in the private or the family office space, private company or family office space, is it acting as a mediation arm for the family office or for the overall organization? So I like to think of this mediation area as the concept of them being able, or a board successfully being able to mediate anything that comes up in the boardroom or in support of the organization. So asking yourself these questions is extremely important to first understand if the architecture or the structure of the board needs to be evaluated. So as we jump into this, I want you to think throughout our discussion today, specifically about 3 areas. So as we mentioned earlier, if we think about the vertical considerations of your board, we're going to correlate that into the terminology of your sphere of influence. And this is talking about your board's expertise, vertical considerations. Horizontal considerations is what builds your board's character. And these are what's considered to be your planes of congruence, or the horizontal areas to look at and to build into your board's architecture or your structure. Oops, wrong way. And then we have the depth considerations, another highly overlooked area for boards. This has to do with the coverage and balance, which creates the depth of your board. And you'll see, and you may be able to reference back to boards that you even currently serve on, that if any one of these components is missing, the board is not as effective or efficient as it needs to be, or as it should be. So let's jump in and talk first about the high level of, again, sphere of influence being your vertical expertise. We see in many cases that most boards sorely lack in the understanding of how a new member, or even rebuilding of a board or building a board from scratch, they lack the focus on the horizontal character, and they lack the focus on the coverage and balance, which equates to the depth. We'll go through those now. So let's start out with the board sphere of influence, and this should be very clear in how we've laid this out in our visual. So again, understand a board's sphere of influence creates the important foundational expertise elements of your board, but it's a little bit deeper than that. And if we look at this in a true circle or a sphere of influence, we want to think about this as having really 3 concentric rings when we think about this first step for your sphere of influence. One is, does every board member have a core leadership competency? Seems like a pretty generic question, but I can tell you that even some of the largest public company boards, they don't have core leadership competencies that are modern core leadership competencies. They have older experiences that are not really today what I would view as modern day leadership competencies. Operational competency, this is huge. And you're going to see in a moment how I make the correlation to boards that are able to come up with great input and great strategy and great guidance. If they're not right-sized, or the folks on the board don't have in-depth operational knowledge or competency, they're not able to right-size those and make those applicable to the organizations that they're serving. And then, of course, we get to the skill set competencies. And let's drill down a little bit into each one of these areas here in our path. So core leadership competency, some questions I directly ask and probe into with the clients I work with in the board space. Does every board member have proven deep experience in strategy creation? You'd be amazed at the times that this answer comes back no. Also, has every board member shown skill in proper and effective governance? You'd be amazed at how many times this answer comes back no. You have executives that have led teams. You have executives that have been involved, or even board members that have built out models in governance, but they don't have formal governance and formal strategy background, which hurts these organizations. Demonstrated an ability to motivate team members and shown great leader traits such as clear vision, courage, integrity, honesty, and humility. These may seem like very obvious areas, but I will tell you, you want to focus on these particular pieces in the vetting processes that you put forth for either new members coming on your board, or if you're looking to rebuild the structure of your board. Don't take these for granted. It's very common that the answer on these comes back as a no, that many folks are just not up to speed in the modern day configurations and knowledge areas. All right, we talked a little bit about the operations expertise, but again, just to drill a little bit further, proven deep experience in implementing their strategies. Have they created effective governance mechanisms? Have they right-sized their strategies to the organization's capabilities? Huge mismatch with boards right now. You have, in some cases, board members that are coming from Fortune 500 companies that are asked to serve, in some cases, on private boards. They're not able to right-size their inputs into that particular size or growth phase of that organization. And have they adapted their strategies to ever-changing delivery challenges? Another super important area to drill down further into, to make sure that every board member, or at least the majority of the board members on your team, have deep operations experience. And then, as part of your sphere of influence in this first step, then we talk about the skill set, competencies, and experience. Note that so far in my discussion, I have not talked about the names of board directors. I have not talked about the experience or the background or the title of board directors. It's a mistake to focus on those first. You want to have your plan in place first on what your organization actually needs. So defining the skill set competencies and the level of experience that's matched to the growth phase of the organization and possibly the next upcoming 1 or 2 growth phases of the organization is significantly important before you start piecing in names or specific titles to this board. So what are the types of skill sets you need? We're going to drill a little further down into this in a moment, but think about this at the highest level of expertise areas in finance and technology and marketing and legal, human resources. And we're also I'm going to show you how it's best practice to match these skill sets back to directly correlate them to the board committees. And I'll show you how that's a best practice when we talk about board architecture and board structure. All right, so a few examples of this. And these are pulled with the names, of course, excluded, but pulled directly from some of my board consulting clients. This is from an actual technology services business. So even with an existing smaller amount of board members in place, we went back and did a full study of the architecture of their board, what's called a board architecture assessment. And we looked at what does this organization need from a standpoint of internal facing as well as external facing requirements. You'll see some on here that are quite common to boards, right? You'll see a human resources area, technology, in this case, the cybersecurity area is broken out. But you may see some areas here that are not common, and one of them being politics, ties to legislation. And the example of this, just for our purposes today at a high level, is to say that many technology companies are able to leverage upcoming legislation that's coming out. So in the US, if we look back at Sarbanes-Oxley or Dodd-Frank, those were boons for the technology industry in terms of their offerings. So it was decided with the input of this particular board build that they would have someone that was a retired representative in some way of government, but was still able to understand what certain regulations were coming down the pike and how those could be applied to upcoming offerings. Again, very different than what most normal boards would put in place, but for this board, they wanted this to be part of their innovation area, and we linked some of the upcoming legislation ties to that. One example. All right, let's correlate this to a public company. This is from a client of mine in the construction area, construction vertical. So the areas in green: compensation, nominating, audit, and governance. In this case, in the US and many global jurisdictions, these are requirements based on the public disclosure and transparency and compliance areas. But you'll see other areas here: human capital, technology, cybersecurity. This particular group wanted to add the knowledge they felt that they were lacking for the last 20 years, the knowledge of the real estate markets. So we specifically searched out an executive in the real estate area that also had board certifications to make them a valuable member of the team. Construction and development, and of course, risk areas. So you can see that we're expecting that they all have core leadership competency, that they all have operations background, meaning that they've applied their competency skill set. And then, of course, what are the areas of the board in terms of the expertise areas that are being looked for? All right. And let me correlate this now. This is an example of a nonprofit organization, but I want to talk about the correlation to the board committee areas. So each one of these areas here, and it is best practice as closely as possible for you to apply and correlate the expertise areas on your board directly to the board committees, right? I am not a fan of organizations or boards where they have directors at large, right? Or directors that don't have some sort of tie either as a chair or a member of a committee. It does not bode well for the overall structure of the board, and it does not bode well for the involvement of each board member. So in any opportunity you have to correlate the board member directly into either one or multiple committee areas, it is a best practice. So in this case, you'll see this board actually was a total of 8 people. And then they supplemented some of the committee areas with folks from their emeritus board as well as advisors to keep their board lean and mean and tight and able to be extremely efficient. You'll see here, just for those on this call, I know a few of my connections have joined in the nonprofit space as well. Know that I laser focus on the following 3 areas when it comes to board structure as it relates to nonprofit areas. And if they're missing either one or more of these areas, I can tell you you're having issues. That's the following for nonprofits: the development area, the program area, and the marketing area. If your board is missing expertise in those areas, that also has core leadership and operations expertise, I can tell you that's not going to be a successful formula for your nonprofit as you move into the future. If you're interested in more of that, we can talk offline. There's studies I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years on that topic and comparing them back to nonprofit areas that I work with. Okay, common sphere of influence. Again, if we look at the sphere of influence as individuals, and then we also compare that to board committees, this shouldn't be surprising. Some of the standing committees, some may correlate those to permanent committees. There are slight differences between that terminology in certain jurisdictions around the globe. And then, of course, the ad hoc committees. But again, get in the mindset when we talk about the first step of your sphere of influence, get in the mindset of specifically searching out folks on the board that have expertise in these areas of expertise that also apply to the correlated committee area or board committee area. All right, so most boards that you'll see out there are boards that you're serving on or boards that you will serve on. They focus for the most part on that step one. Maybe they focused in drilling down on the core leadership aspects. Maybe they focused also on the vetting of and looking more deeply into the correlation or the experience in the operations space. But most boards, again, have looked at what type of skill sets do we need and how does that work. But most boards stop there. It makes them what I call very monolithic boards. They have no depth to them. They have no character to them. Anybody can put a group or a team together or a board together that has skill set that they're looking for. But what they're missing are the following 2 steps, right? So let's first talk about your planes of congruence. And you should be thinking of your planes of congruence as the horizontal considerations or things that look across the entire board for how you're going to build a character. So planes of congruence create the important character elements of your board. And visually, I want you to think about this. We spoke a moment ago of your sphere of influence, the step 1. Think about that circle I showed you now as laid down at the bottom of this. So you have your skill sets defined and potentially what exactly you need for your board to make sure it's effective. But now I want to show you visually these different planes that go horizontally and sit above and horizontally above that sphere of influence that we just talked about. So let's give you some examples of this. So a few things to mention. There's no limit to the number of planes of congruence that you can define for your board, meaning that you may have 4, you may have 2, you may have 10. I've worked with boards that have 15 in there. It adds a little bit of complexity to the build of the board, but it depends on how far and how much effort you want to take the build or the planning side of your board. I will say the deeper you take that, the more effective and efficient the board is in the long term. And it sets the right behaviors from day one, particularly in your board. Let's use this as an example. This is an example from an organization from about a year and a half ago I worked with. And with my guidance on this, we decided on a few areas that I had proposed and a few areas that they were very interested in putting in. And I'll show you what requirements we came up with here. So one is, I am a strict believer that every board director should have a background in formal governance and formal strategy. And the reason those are grouped together is that you cannot govern something if you do not understand the strategy, because the strategy is also linked to the goals, right? So whole nother discussion for us to talk about the interrelationship between governance and strategy. But I can tell you that even if you're vetting board directors as potential members coming to your board, ask them the very simple question. This is one of my secret questions when I'm building out nominating committee processes and then getting involved in helping them with their vetting. It's the question of, tell me about your understanding of the interrelationship between governance and strategy. And then just sit back and wait for the answer. Most executives and most board directors cannot actually answer that question. And for me, it's a litmus test and a bellwether for understanding whether or not they're going to be a great board director. So for me, I always recommend you have this first area in your planes of congruence of the understanding of strategy and governance. You can set this as either every board member has it or a percentage, right? 50% of more is what I usually like to see. 50% or more of every board director has deep formal knowledge, understanding, and potentially training in strategy and governance. In this case, there was also the ability, or they wanted to have the ability to have a generational span and an age range on their board. 100% behind this. We're seeing a lot of this push right now when we talk about both DEI as well as the inclusion components of this. Diversity was another piece, the women to men ratio. We'll talk about what they actually, in a moment, what they decided on. Personality traits, I'm going to come back to this one as well in a moment. I think you need to have personality traits on a board. This is true of any type of deliberation or discussion, or when you're looking for the best outcome. If you have all of the same personality trait, or you're missing some personality traits on a board or any decision-making body, I can tell you, you do not come out, the outcome is not to the level it should be when the personality traits are too close. Emotional intelligence, or EQ, how you deal with challenges, how you deal with your emotions. These are areas that I believe you cannot be even a successful leader, not to mention a successful board director, without having in-depth and honed emotional intelligence. And then we talk about common vertical knowledge and varying industry backgrounds. And let me show you the example of how this was applied. But I want to mention in this, if we start from the top down now in a populated version of your step 2 planes of congruence, know that a common best practice at this moment is not to have any more than 25% of the board members seated on your board from the industry that that company serves. A prime example of this is that we see boards in the pharmaceutical industry and the construction or legal area, where life science is also as an example, where it is expected that everybody on that board, 8, 10, 12 members, all come with a background from either pharmaceutical or life sciences. And it actually is detrimental to these boards. They become these insulated boards. They have no other outlets or understanding of what other industries are doing or what other industry verticals are doing. So best practice in this now for any industry and any industry vertical is to have no more than 25% industry overlap within that particular organization that you're serving as a board member. In this case, because it was a technology services organization, they were looking for, however, a minimum of the board members to have some sort of services business or consulting background. And that to me was smart because it allows for both sides of the table viewpoint. I'll give a little bit of detail again as we go through this with some of the tactical areas, just so you understand how this is being looked at, to make sure that you're getting that viewpoint you need, but not limiting yourself and creating a bubble of intelligence within your board. Plane number 5, emotional intelligence. It was a requirement of this board for every board member to have a honed emotional intelligence. They did not want to deal with folks that if they were challenged for something they were proposing, that they took it personally. They didn't want any emotion coming into the boardroom. They wanted to make sure that every board member was highly experienced and honed in this emotional intelligence area. Personality traits, I mentioned a moment ago. I look for a balance of these particular personality traits. I want an analyst, a diplomat, a sentinel, and explorer, and I want a balance of them on my board as much as possible. So as I'm looking to fill the previously mentioned step 1 of my sphere of influence, I'm also laying over this the understanding that there's a deeper look to build the character of my board, of making sure I have a balance of personality characteristics. So the analyst looking at all the data, the diplomat making sure the bylaws are being followed and that everybody has a chance to speak. The sentinel is the protector of what the organization wants to do. So they're commonly looking out and comparing back to the values, the vision, and the mission of the organization. And then the explorer, that to me is the innovator, or the person that has the idea and the mindset of an entrepreneur, right? It is impossible to get to the best outcomes without having representation from each one of these different mindsets or personality traits in any decision-making body, not to mention a board of directors. For diversity, the board decided on a minimum of 30% women. They actually beat that. I think they got to about 40% women on the board. Another great thing to strive for. The age range, we actually opened up the age range on this. We knew that we wanted to have the background and the generational experiences to weigh in from all the decision-making aspects. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit about my book, where I talk about what each generation brings to this. If you're interested in drilling further down into this, it talks about how having this diverse board in terms of age range and generational span and what inputs to their particular life and how they formed their whole personality, how that helps in the decision-making process, especially for a governance body such as a board. And of course, I mentioned earlier about strategy and governance. For me, this is an absolute must. If you can't answer certain questions or show that you've been involved at multiple levels across strategy and governance, that to me is a showstopper. You as somebody on a board has to decide what level you want to take that to, but I am a stickler for that. It's almost impossible to get your board to the level of effectiveness and efficiency without having a deep level of knowledge, either in every board director or a certain percentage of board directors within your team. All right. Now, some other areas, if we look at this horizontal planes of congruence, which again builds your character of your board, think about these areas. The first two I mentioned already. We have age range, generational span, diversity components, personality traits, intelligence as it relates to vertical backgrounds or industry vertical backgrounds, right? EQ, there's other areas such as MQ for mindfulness intelligence, team intelligence. There's ways to test for this. Some boards that take this all the way to one side of wanting to really understand every aspect with a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to it. There's testing and different evaluations that can be done for those. A big one that's being looked at right now, and COVID-19 opened the door for different geography where boards are not as scared at this point to actually pull somebody in from an entirely different region or zone or time zone, because they're more open to the virtual aspect of their board meeting. So it's not as much, especially right now, about those board members being in the same geography and in the same time zone. They're able to be just as effective through their video conferencing. All right, so keep in mind what we're talking about here, and you should be able to see at a high level how this builds the character of your board and stops it from all being the same people, same personality, same background, same approach, same decision-making processes. You want to get this character in your decision-making body of your board to have the best outputs and the best outcomes. All right, I know we're rushing through this. Again, if you want more detail, I'll talk in a moment about how you can get that. So board coverage and balance. This is the last area of the three that we talk about the depth of the board, right? So how do areas of in your design, your proactive design of your board, how are you building in that coverage and balance, which creates the depth of the board? Let me explain what that means. So first off, when we talk about coverage and balance, coverage, we're talking about, do you have or have you ensured that you've engaged at least one true expert in each of your designed sphere of influence areas, while also meeting your planes of congruence, the first two steps we talked about a moment ago? That ensures the coverage. I'll show you an example visually of that in a moment. The balance of the board is another highly overlooked area, but extremely important. Is there or have you incorporated a strategic and predetermined overlap of expertise and experience as it relates to your board sphere of influence, and also meeting your planes of congruence requirements? And I'm going to explain why this is important. So if we look at the following example, which I'll apply this to, the way that this particular board build or this example was designed, we wanted obviously at least one subject matter expert in each sphere of influence area, right? The skill set and expertise. And we wanted to have at least one additional deep knowledge individual in each of the sphere of influence areas as they correlated to committees. And let me show you what that looks like here. So let me give you the background and the structure of this. So across the top in blue, as an example, we're saying that this is what this board decided as their sphere of influence areas, right? To make it easy for our example. And then in the study of each of the board members, and this was a look at their actual board now before they decided either to add board members or look at restructuring their board. Each of the board members was evaluated for their core expertise area as a subject matter expert. Those are the number ones you see in green. And then which board members also had deep knowledge. Now, the design for this board was to say we wanted coverage of at least, again, one subject matter expert in each of our sphere of influence areas. And we want to have at least one additional individual that has overlap in some way with deep knowledge. And the reason for this, a great example to talk about this, is that many boards right now are struggling in the cybersecurity area. So what do? They go out, they bring somebody in that's either the overlap into the technology area, or they're specifically focused in the cybersecurity area as a board member. It's a great area right now to be in if you're packaging yourself as a viable board member as it relates to the technology vertical. So, but in saying that, when you only have one person that's the subject matter expert and nobody else on that board has any level of knowledge, maybe they have number 4, a minimal level of knowledge, nobody is there to be able to challenge what that particular board member proposes, especially if they're the chair of a committee area, right? So if we look at this here in the technology space, with the caveat or the requirement of one SME and at least one other board member that has overlap in the deep knowledge area, anything that subject matter expert proposes in the boardroom can be challenged, validated, vetted by the other person that has some level of knowledge there without there just being a bubble of decision-making, right? Human resources or human capital is more so being called today, right? There are folks in this particular example, 2 of them, that have deep knowledge as number 2s, but there's no subject matter expert that's been defined as part of this board. They are lacking in this area. So they don't have the SME coverage, so their knowledge of their depth of knowledge is actually the downward facing arrow. Finance. They have 2 SMEs here. I would hope that one of them is serving as the chair of the finance committee for this particular board. And they do have some backup. There are other board members there that have backup in the deep knowledge area, as well as one other SME. That finance discussion to me would be quite an in-depth discussion for anything that's proposed or anything that's being looked at or probed into by that particular board. You get the gist of where I'm going with this here. This depth allows for decision-making to be done by not just one individual that is solely relying, or the remainder of the board is solely relying on their input and their expertise, but it allows for the debate and the discussions to happen by having this depth of coverage in a board, which is why we call this, again, the coverage and balance areas. Another greatly important area to look at in your board, and you can likely see how it's integrated comparing back to your sphere of influence areas. There's definitely touch points on the balance of who you decide on or who you select as it relates to the character or the planes of congruence of your board. And then, of course, here you're looking at the balance and the coverage to make sure that you can have the in-depth discussions that you require in a boardroom. All right. I know we talked about a lot of stuff. I want to make sure we have enough time. Lucy, I see there's questions coming in, but just as a quick close on my side before we get to Q&A, if you're interested on much more detail on this and more the integrated viewpoint of those 3 particular areas of your sphere of influence, your planes of congruence, and your coverage and balance, I welcome you to pick up a copy of my book. This is the in-depth background of how this works. Don't be scared by the detail I mentioned today. Don't be scared by the detail in the book. You take this to the level that you think is right sized for your organization, but at the very least, you have a plan, you have a path, and you have a roadmap to follow and how to do this correctly. Some boards decide not to do this overnight. They want to incorporate it in as they have board members retire and new board members come in. If you're a new organization in the private space or in the PE space, it's a great way to look at how do you change some of the areas that are just not correct in how you're going about building your board. So different ways to look at it. Finally, before we get to Q&A, an exciting day for Shaparency and for Pfister Strategy Group. We are announcing our partnership in the education, the board education and certification area. Shaparency is our newest partner in this space. I welcome you to check out Shaparency's partner webpage on this topic. And all the details I talked about today, plus many more on how to package yourself properly for viable consideration in boards globally. All of this is incorporated into this course. We believe it's one of the most robust, or is the most robust course out there right now, with multiple parallel learning paths. Plus, you're getting a global, internationally recognized certification when you're done with this course. 12 weeks, 12 modules. Ton of information. The folks that have been through this have been extremely impressed with it. So we welcome Shaparency to our partnership, and we think it's going to be fun. All right, Lucy, let's move to some questions. I know I've done a lot of talking so far. I'd like to hear some other voices here, or at least you read some other questions that came in.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much. You rattled through it. It was yeah, really fantastic. So yeah, we've had a lot of questions, but there's still time to get some more in. So please do feel free to type one in the Q&A box now, and we'll try and get to it. So we'll start with one from Jeff. There must be space in a board to develop new members. No board can be 100% members with depth and experience of governance. Can you invite novice board members to develop them for the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would tell you that I love the question. I love the comment on it. There is, I believe, an article link that you'll see in this presentation, or if you see some of the links, you'll get to that article, and it's called the Learning Board. And another easy indicator, or what I call a board's observables, is that if a board is not open to learning or training, I can tell you that's an indicator of other areas that are not right in that board. So many boards, if we talk about even that age or generational span, and the example I used was an age range of 35, I think, to 80 something, right? Which usually you'll see a mandatory retirement age around 72 up to 75. Some boards are not heeding that, whatever they decide to do. But in most cases, the younger age of the board members, it's for exactly that reason. They want to bring in some of that new blood and some of the new concepts and ideas, but they understand also there's going to have to be training there. The program I just mentioned actually is a prime example. So many of the boards I work with that have younger board members that they've brought into the board, they actually put them as an example through my program to bring them up to speed with all the basics in the background, to allow them to be an effective board member. So absolutely, I think, and by the way, that may be one of your planes of congruence, that no more than 90% of your board are experienced board directors. 10% or one seat is always going to be allocated to a newer board member. You can design all of this into your board structure and have it follow through and know that you have a path and a plan. Extremely powerful.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoy the way you say congruence. I think we've got a tomato situation there. Congruence.
How do you say? Go ahead and say it.
Pardon?
How do you say it? Go ahead.
Congruence.
Congruent. All right. Yeah. I got the US version of it. You have the UK version.
Yeah.
So I'll test it out in a moment.
Yeah. So when you look at strategy as a plane, should you also consider risk as a plane of congruence?
You could, absolutely. And again, it's up to you what you decide. On one of the examples there, I believe it was for the public company, the sphere of influence area was viewed in that particular example as a sphere of influence area was showing risk. But you could also say multiple things in the sphere of influence. In your planes of congruence, your horizontal. Risk could be one. Diversity, equity, and inclusion could be one. You could have that as a sphere of influence vertical, or you could have it spread across the board where you want a certain number or percentage of folks that have ESG background, DEI, risk, right? You design that in. Many boards are actually separating areas that used to be horizontal planes of congruence areas and making them permanent seats in the sphere of influence area, such as ESG, DEI, and risk for that matter as well.
Got a great question here. Is it better for an organization to see a harmonious, aligned board, or one where there is clearly healthy debate and difference of opinion?
Great question. And I again hope that my article link is in here for those that download the presentation later. So no, number one, but there's a concept that I call the art of respectful dissent, right? So let me link a few concepts here a moment ago. In the planes of congruence, right, that you mentioned, I had an area there that talked about emotional intelligence, right? Emotional intelligence has a direct correlation back to the ability to have somebody challenge you or somebody disagree with you, but you don't lose your cool, you don't get emotional, you come back in a way that's not combative, you come back in a way that a mature person would form a debate, right? I call that the art of respectful dissent, right? And so the point of all this is if one of your planes of congruence is listed as high EQ and even high MQ, which is mindfulness intelligence, you avoid the emotional response back in a decision-making action. And you don't even have to worry about that anymore if you have folks that you've actually evaluated for being deep knowledge and having a honed experience in those areas. So now it becomes simply an idea escalation rather than a debate. I don't even like to use the word debate in the boardroom, because if you have truly honed EQ and MQ, it's a discussion that everybody understands is driving to a higher outcome, right? So there's ways to even measure that. I'll give you a quick example. I write about this in my book. I use an online test, believe it or not, called the Gordon Personal Profile Inventory, a GPPI. And it's not designed for evaluating your level of emotional intelligence, but there are correlations in there. It measures against 9 traits, basically, the trait of ascendance, the trait of charisma, and those particular aspects. And it tells you how this person deals in not only stressful and crisis environments, but also how they value relationships. If you value a relationship, you don't immediately go like you see some of these trolls online where they'll write the meanest thing they can think of, the first response back, right? There's that connection in that relationship and the camaraderie that's built with the board. Great example. Again, I highly recommend you read this article, The Art of Respectful Dissent, and it gets into the concept of how you can design that into your board through your planes of congruence.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time, Lucy, on that answer, because to me, that's one of the most important concepts to get your board, and through the architecture and the proactive approach, to get your board to a group of individuals that work as a team. They're not there to challenge one another. They're there to elevate one another. It's a total difference. You can design that into your team. And we talked about that throughout the 3 areas of of the architecture components.
Great, thank you. This one, I want to read an Australian accent for some reason. I won't, but great prezzo, Mark. In the board, in the board sphere of influence, where is innovation? And he's given the example of disruptive risk of startups, or ECG, and he's given the example of social license to operate or climate risk.
Sure. So remember that my examples are exactly that, examples. I would tell you right now, the fact that this person asked that question, I would think that innovation is hugely important. And it may be that one of their sphere of influence areas is directly associated with the innovation space, or somebody that comes in with a background in innovation. You then would have to decide for the balance of industry. Is it more important for that innovation person to have a background in your particular industry or industry vertical? Do you want that person to come from outside your particular industry as you create your balance in your design? Absolutely. Now, innovation, as I mentioned earlier, could be one of those same points where it can be a vertical consideration where it's actually a seated expert board member in that space, right? Your sphere of influence. Or you could define that in your horizontal planes of congruence, right? Where that 30% or 40% of the people on your board have to also, in addition to their sphere of influence area, have to have a background of innovation in that particular area. Now, one other thing to mention, and you'll see this in another article, I don't think it's part of the links in here, but I think it's hugely important to include innovation in the governance structure of an organization. And that may seem very obvious, but I can tell you many of the boards I'm working with in the public space right now are actually carving out the innovation divisions from their organizations in the way that information rolls up to the board. They're effectively carved out, the innovation groups are carved out from the board's purview and oversight. Prime example, Microsoft has done this in some of their areas with the argument that governance hinders innovation. And when I think about this, I say to myself, when the board is structured properly and the board should actually elevate innovation in an organization. But if a board is not functioning properly, I can tell you they can get in the way. But to me, a group that wants to separate from the governance umbrella of a board, such as innovation, they have no respect for their board whatsoever. So it goes back to earlier, those 5 areas. Is the board respected? I can tell you in that organization, the innovation department does not respect their board if they ask to be carved out from any type of input or oversight.
Okay, thank you. How often should we evaluate the board?
I like to see it done yearly. I'll leave it at that. You know, if it's done correctly, it is a large exercise to do that. It takes effort. It takes time to do it correctly. For me, when I do those types of evaluations, I incorporate, as you can likely imagine, I incorporate the board architecture component. That's my starting point, actually. And I build off of that what's called a board architecture assessment. So most boards do this very superficially. They look at the skill set balance, or they do a skill set assessment. But as you know now from today's discussion, that only touches on one piece of one of the 3 components for a successful board in the sphere of influence area, right? It touches on nothing related to character. It touches on nothing commonly related to the depth and the coverage of those boards. So I would tell you, if you're going to do it right, put the effort into it, and then do something about the outcome from it. You'd be amazed at the number of boards that do that assessment every year, and it never even comes up again. They never talk about it. It's done more as just a check the box type of exercise. Those boards pay the price for that because they're not taking or heeding the warnings, and I'll call them warnings because they are, of what's actually undermining the efficiency and the effectiveness of their boards. Once a year, though, is my answer to that.
Right. I think this question follows on from what you just said. Is the same selection process and approach applicable when looking at the chair of the board?
Which selection?
I think that was referring to the one major and then the minor specialist.
Okay, all right. I like to think the following: if your board is structured properly, and you have the backgrounds and the skill sets across all 3 areas we discussed, the ability for any board member to serve as a chair should be possible. Right? That means that everybody on that team is versed and they have a formal background in board directorship. And it brings up the concept also of what's called it's slipping my mind right now. I remember it's your career trifecta. Sorry. And your career trifecta is a balance, especially needed in the board space, of your expertise, what you know, your experience, how you've applied it. And the third area is the ongoing education piece. So what is the proof that you're viewing board directorship as more than just a hobby, that it's a discipline for you, right? So that proof area is the education and the certification components. I talked about ours earlier and how we go about making sure that balance is built into how you view yourself. But to directly answer the question, you could absolutely put in there in one of your requirements area, instead of saying that one of the person or one of the people we select for our board in the sphere of influence area is also going to have the ability to be the chair. That is good, but it locks you into only that person being able to be the chair of your organization, right? And I'm not into a chair of an organization for more than 3 or 4 years. Even that is a large amount, right? I want to have that turnover in the board to have, or even outside the board, to have somebody else or new blood come into that chair position. So I would look at the chair component being built into the architecture as more so an area to say in your planes of congruence, which is at least 30% of my board has the ability to take the chairman's seat should it be needed. And by the way, that's also the ability to have a backup should something happen to the current chairperson, who is the immediate succession plan person for that area, right? So there's ways to look at this again as a much bigger strategy and a much bigger architectural component on the proactive realm, instead of saying, can one person take this role? This one person is able to do it, but I have 2 others on my board that are available, and at least one of them knows that they are the backup should something happen, anything to that particular current chair as part of our succession planning. There's a much deeper picture to all of us to make this really effective.
Thanks. We've got someone, an anonymous attendee, who's, I think, wanting a bit of dirt to be dished. Are there any examples of boards that have let down their shareholders during the pandemic?
Oh, God. I will tell you, and again, another article, and there is a link to this, and it's called Post-COVID Pivots, or Pivots for the Post-COVID Board. And I can tell you, I'll give you a few quick examples of this. Number one, absolutely, something that was noticed within the first month was the concept of overboarding. So overboarding, for those that don't know, is when a board director is sitting on so many boards or has so many requirements of either at the executive level or the number of boards they sit on, they cannot dedicate the required amount of time or focus to all the boards they serve on. So oddly enough and unbelievably, there were remote board meetings taking place that only had half of their board members because the time wasn't there for the other half to actually join. And what came from that was an immediate plane of congruence area that was added, that no more than, as an example, 25% of the board members can individually sit on more than 2 boards. That was one outcome. It was directly brought back into the design of that particular board. Another one that many were surprised about that caused problems for organizations, which we started to do a little more in-depth studies on, was boards became the emotional support arm of the CEO of their organization. So think about this. Think about the pressure on the CEO of any size organization, not to mention global organizations, as all of these things were happening, not just in the early stages of COVID, but even in the middle and latter stages of COVID, right? All of a sudden, boards were put in this realm of having to supply this emotional support to their CEO. They should have been doing that anyway, quite frankly, right? If you have good EQ and MQ, that should always be something you're evaluating. What is the mindset of the leader of the organization? But the boards that did not focus on that are viewed as too touchy-feely, or said, you know what, we're here to select the CEO and govern the CEO. We're not here to make them feel good about themselves, right? Or support them. Those organizations had struggles because that trickles down, that type of values trickles down into the culture, and that culture, of course, affects the entire organization. All this stuff is linked. If there's one thing you take away from today, is that the interrelationship of everything I'm talking about right now, they're not standalone. They all have some sort of relationship, and that's why we have to look at these holistically. But organizations and boards, absolutely. I gave 2 of 7 examples that you can read about of areas that boards struggled with throughout COVID, and it's not over yet. There are boards that are still having issues from this, even to this day, and they likely will continue on for months into the future.
Yeah, unfortunately so. Thank you. A couple of questions from Tim, but I'll just read out his final one. I think we've got time for just a couple more, and then we'll wrap it up. We've had loads, so I'm sure there's going to be some homework for you to do, Mark.
Yeah, that's fine.
What skill or knowledge piece is it that boards often overlook? He's
I
given
think
these,
it's a
it's
tough,
cyber or digital.
yeah, it's a tough question to generalize because it's dependent on the board itself and what they decide they need. So in many cases, I will tell you, however, and I'm going to relate this question back to that step one sphere of influence area. Once it's decided, when again you're starting out with no names, nothing having to do other than the fact of the skill set areas, right? And you decide what areas of expertise you need to properly support the CEO and the organization. And to lower risk, by the way, if you're missing one of those expertise areas that's important to your organization, if you're missing one, you're increasing the risk of the organization. But things right now that I see as, and I call these your hot expertise areas, and know that some of these, again, can be applied as either a vertical area of expertise or a horizontal. Something we talk about in the course I mentioned earlier is how do you balance your vertical areas of expertise with your horizontal areas of expertise to give you that depth of viability for as a board candidate. So areas right now that I see, one of them that can be applied at both a horizontal and a vertical is ESG. DEI is another one that fits across both. Technology is usually a hot buzzword right now. I will tell you, for me personally, in my packaging, my proper packaging as a board director, I show the correlation of technology / cybersecurity. For me, I've combined those two because I can make a board more efficient by combining the technology background and cybersecurity. And I have my certifications in the back end on that as well to support that as part of that career trifecta I mentioned earlier. Another big one I see right now, and if I correlate back to an earlier comment I made about regulation, right? So we're seeing in many jurisdictions and in many countries right now, the push for disclosure on ESG areas, as well as corporate and social responsibility areas, right? And I also mentioned earlier that we're seeing even the name change on a board from human resources to human capital. And the reason you're seeing that is that, to answer this question, is human capital is another hot area for board directorship, is that the requirement for disclosure and transparency and what many jurisdictions are requiring to be in compliance is amazing. And it's not just the run-of-the-mill check the box areas. It's specific requirements that somebody with a background in not just human resources, but someone in human capital area needs to report on and understand if the board is in compliance and if the organization is in compliance in those spaces. So there's probably a bunch more I could mention, but those are the ones that immediately come to mind. But for those of you that have a human resources background that's converting that into the bigger, more strategic aspect of human capital, I can tell you, you're going to have a busy career in the board space, especially as this legislation starts to trickle down across the globe right now.
Great tip. So I think maybe time for one more from Abby. What are your views on maximum terms for board members?
Great question. I'm gonna combine it with a few answers that made me think of this, or a few areas to focus. So first one is, and I'm surprised the question wasn't asked yet, is what is the perfect size for my board, right? So let's start with that area. You should know by now that when someone asks me that question, I know that they're not versed in board architecture, because the size of your board is dependent on what we talked about in step one of your board architecture, which is your sphere of influence. That defines the minimum number of people that you can have on your board, and also how it correlates back into your board committee areas. So that's one area. To the question of age limit, I think you asked a moment ago, right?
Maximum terms of,
maximum terms.
Okay. Yeah, sorry.
And I'm going to correlate that back into two areas. So, and we could probably think about this even from a governmental area right now also. I am big on term limits for board directors, and you're seeing many organizations globally now implement this. Many of them are actually cutting it back from 3 terms to 2 currently, right? And those terms, it's all dependent on what that term is considered to be, right? And maybe it's worthwhile to take one step back. We're moving more out of the realm of what's called a classified board, which is a board that says each one of your terms is 2 or 3 years, and they're overlapped. So not everybody on that board comes up for re-election every year, right? So we're moving away from that model of classified, or what's called staggered boards, into more of shareholders and stakeholders want every year to be able to weigh in on those particular board directors if they still want them there. So first and foremost, you're going to see a lot more shareholder and stakeholder intervention in not only getting rid of a staggered board or a classified board format, but move it into a yearly votes for every single board member. And we're seeing that right now. We just saw an example of this in multiple public global companies, even at the last proxy season that came through. So I think the outside activism is going to push for the yearly voting, and that is going to become the driver for the term limits, right? For the amount of time for each term, right? Then when we talk about term limits, you know, you're usually looking at 2 to 3 for whatever that time frame is allocated for. And then that also plays into the mandatory retirement ages, which commonly right now, it was 72 on average or 73 for a long time. Those age limits are actually being increased on average right now for 2 reasons. One is finding, based on what I'm describing in today's webinar, those best board directors is getting harder, right? They're coming with aspects and pieces, but not the whole deal. And also, it's in times of crises, you'll find that many boards actually raise their mandatory retirement age. They don't want additional strife and upheaval on their board and their organization at the same time they're dealing with large crises in the organization. So hopefully that answers that question in a much bigger realm of looking at it more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you answered a couple of questions there that are already lined up. So that's brilliant. There are more questions, but we haven't got time, I'm afraid. We've come to the end of our session. So Mark, if you could slip us on to the next, the final slide. It's just a huge thank you from Shaparency to Mark for doing this for us, our first session. It's just been absolutely mind-blowing with the amount of information you've got into there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for joining. There's more information and you can book a demo of how Shaparency works and what we do at shaparency.com. For further information, this series of events we hope will run and we hope it will be enlightening and useful. And there are many to come. So please check out upcoming events at shaparency.com/events. And then the final comment is there's going to be more information, all the links, all the PDF of the slides from today, where you can get more information from Mark, where you can get more information from Shaparency in our follow-up email, which will be going out tomorrow. So yeah, all the links are on there. And if you need any more, there's emails where you can get in touch as well. So once again, thanks to Mark and thanks to everyone for joining today's session. Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.